So every morning you wake up and, within seconds, your brain just seamlessly remembers your name, your job, um, your ongoing anxieties, and probably your grudges, too.
Oh, absolutely. It's an instant download.
Right. And you probably take this entirely for granted, but neurologically speaking, your brain is actually aggressively reconstructing you from scratch in those first few waking moments.
Desperately stitching it all
Yeah,
together.
exactly. Just stitching together memories to keep you from dissolving into absolute chaos, which to me begs a really fascinating and, well, kind of uncomfortable question.
Go for it.
If you are listening to this deep dive right now to learn, to grow, to somehow awaken to new ideas, who exactly is the you that wants to do the awakening? Is it just that reconstructed morning self?
That underlying friction, that exact question, is really the foundation of Daniel Tanguay's work, specifically his text, The Imbalance of Ego, the Architecture of Self.
Right, which is a chapter tucked inside his larger work, The Middle Pillar, the Third,
Yeah.
The Architecture of Awareness.
Yes, exactly. It's a dense, challenging chapter. But what Tanguy does here is he completely dismantles this very popular, very pervasive myth.
The idea that the ego is the bad guy.
Right. The idea that the ego is an enemy to be hunted down and destroyed.
Mm.
Because so much of modern self-help or, pop spirituality treats the ego like a parasite, like something you have to starve.
Like it's a disease or something.
Exactly. But Tanguy argues that trying to kill it is not only impossible, it fundamentally misunderstands what the ego was built to do in the first place.
And the framework he uses to explain this is actually what drew me into the text initially. He anchors the entire discussion on a single axiom.
Right, the map and the territory.
Yeah, he says, science is the map, the sacred is the territory, the middle pillar is the bridge.
Such a great way to frame it.
It really is. It struck me as just a brilliant way to approach identity because it demands that we hold two lenses at once, right?
You both perspectives.
We have to look at the hard, measurable neuroscience, the map, without pretending that a brain scan captures the full subjective terror or beauty of actually being alive, which is the territory.
You absolutely need both. Because think about it, relying solely on the map gives you this really clinical, sterile view of human behavior.
So it kind of reduces everything.
It does. It reduces love and fear to just mere chemical gradients. But then relying solely on the territory, pure subjective feeling, well, that leaves you lost in mysticism without a compass.
You become prone to delusion.
Exactly. So the ego, when it's functioning properly, is that bridge. It organizes the raw, overwhelming material of the territory so you can actually navigate it safely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to even begin navigating, we have to look at the primary tool the ego uses to build that bridge.
Which is language?
Language, yeah. Tanguay points out that the ego constructs reality through the inner narrator, that voice in your head that literally never shuts up.
The constant running commentary.
Right. And it does this by drawing boundaries, using words like I and me and mine. And biologically, you need those boundaries. You need to know where your physical body ends and the oncoming bus begins.
That's a pretty important boundary to have.
Very important. But the side effect is that this language carves reality into isolated fragments. It inherently creates, us versus them or humanity versus nature.
What's fascinating here is the fatal design flaw of that inner narrator. It's the authority it claims.
What do you mean by authority?
Well, the narrator doesn't just suggest interpretations, right? It dictates reality.
Oh, I see.
So say your boss sends you a terse email. Your internal monologue doesn't say, here is a string of text lacking emotional tone, which could mean several things.
No, it says, I'm getting fired.
Exactly. It says, you are in danger, you are being disrespected, you are about to be fired. The evolutionary benefit there is speed.
Because speed keeps you alive.
Right. Treating internal assumptions as absolute truth allowed our ancestors to make split-second survival decisions. But in a modern context, a thought arises, and we instantly merge with it. We call it me.
I found myself thinking about it a lot like a smartphone's operating system.
Oh, that's a really good way to picture it.
Yeah, because the OS is essential. It runs your daily background apps like going to work, making dinner, paying taxes.
You can't just delete the OS.
No, you cannot function without the OS managing those boundaries. But a massive glitch occurs when the operating system convinces itself that it is the actual human holding the phone.
It completely forgets it's just an interface?
Yes, it thinks it's the whole universe.
And pushing that analogy even further, a smartphone OS is constantly caching data, right? It's trying to predict what app you want to open next.
Constantly learning your patterns.
Well, the ego operates on a very similar predictive matrix. Realizing that the inner narrator is just a predictive interface, a provisional self, is the critical first step in Tanguay's architecture.
So it's real, but it's not the whole picture.
Precisely. The self is real as a lived experience. You genuinely feel the weight of your history and the sting of those boundaries, but it is entirely limited as an ultimate identity.
So if the ego is basically just a predictive software interface, it has to be running on physical hardware, right? I want to look at the actual circuitry here.
A physical map, basically.
Yeah. When I'm stuck in a loop, agonizing over a past argument or dreading some future meeting, what is mechanically happening in my brain to make that self feel so overwhelmingly solid?
This is where Tanguay brings in the default mode network, or the DMN for short.
Right. I've heard this term thrown around a lot lately.
It's super relevant right now, because for a long time, neuroscience searched for the localized seat of the self. They were looking for a little homunculus sitting in a control room right behind your eyes.
Like a little guy wearing a crown, pulling the levers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we know now that just doesn't exist. Instead, the DMN is this widespread network. It connects the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and several other regions.
And it turns on when we're resting, right?
Well, yeah. It is highly metabolically active when you are doing absolutely nothing. So when you aren't focused on an external task, the DMN just boots up and starts time traveling.
Time traveling how?
It pulls data from your autobiographical memory and projects it into simulations of the future.
So it's essentially a threat simulation machine.
That's a perfect description.
Tanguay explains that when the DMN is balanced, it's actually highly adaptive. I mean, you learn from yesterday to plan for tomorrow. That's useful.
Very useful.
But when it becomes imbalanced, the DMN gets stuck in this predictive processing error. It rehearses old wounds on a loop.
Over and over again.
Yeah, effectively forcing your nervous system to re-experience a past trauma in the present tense, all to predict and prevent a future rejection.
Because the ego demands permanence, and the DMN is the engine trying to enforce that permanence.
It just wants things to stay the same.
It wants a stable, unchanging narrative because stability feels safe to a biological organism. But the irony, as Tanguay outlines, is that the self is actually a pattern in motion.
Not a fixed object.
Right. Impermanence isn't a threat to the organism. Impermanence is literally the only mechanism that allows healing or neuroplasticity to occur.
Okay, that concept makes total sense when we're talking about healing trauma or maybe shifting a bad habit. You want the self to be fluid in those cases.
Of course you do.
But practically speaking, if my identity is constantly shifting, if I am a different pattern in motion every single day, how do I maintain long-term commitments?
That's the paradox.
Yeah, like what keeps me loyal to my partner or my career without feeling like I'm forcing a false permanence?
This raises an important question, and it's exactly why the multi-lens approach is mandatory here.
Because if you only use one lens...
If you look at identity strictly through the lens of impermanence, you just end up with nihilism.
Yeah.
You get this idea that since nothing is solid, nothing actually matters.
Right, which isn't helpful at all.
No. So Tanguay uses this beautiful metaphor of a whirlpool in a river.
Oh, I loved this part.
The water flowing through the whirlpool is never the same from millisecond to millisecond. The actual material is constantly changing.
But the shape stays the same.
Exactly. The whirlpool itself maintains a highly recognizable, stable shape. You can name it, you can map it, you can even predict its behavior.
So I can be the whirlpool.
You are the whirlpool.
Yeah.
You can be a continuous pattern in motion, maintaining deep commitments without needing to freeze the water into a rigid block of ice. Your commitments are the shape of the whirlpool, not the individual drops of water.
That is so freeing. But it begs another question. If identity naturally wants to flow like a whirlpool, why does it so frequently feel like concrete?
Why does it get so stuck?
Yeah. Why does the ego fight so fiercely to stay rigid, especially when our beliefs are challenged?
Because of the environment in which that specific whirlpool formed. And this brings us to what might be the most profound shift in perspective in the entire text.
The idea about arrogance.
Yes. We typically view a massive defensive ego as a symptom of arrogance, right? Just someone being self-important.
Like they just think they're better than everyone else.
But Tanguay argues that the ego is almost never arrogance. It is actually a matrix of scar tissue. It is an armor formed around pain.
Wow.
Think about a child in an unstable environment. The ego learned to aggressively control its surroundings because life was objectively unsafe. It built rigid walls because vulnerability resulted in punishment.
Which means that attacking the ego or, trying to achieve ego death through sheer force is actually a form of spiritual violence against your own nervous system.
It is entirely counterproductive.
You are taking a sledgehammer to the exact structure that kept you alive during your most vulnerable years.
You are fighting the immune system of your own psyche. When we recognize the ego as a wounded guardian rather than an antagonist, the central question of personal growth shifts entirely.
You stop fighting it.
You stop asking, how do I destroy my ego? And you're forced to ask, what is my ego still so desperately trying to protect?
That reframes almost all of our defensive behavior. It totally explains the mechanics of projection in our daily lives.
Oh, it explains so much of how we interact.
Like, let's say someone critiques a spreadsheet you made at work, and suddenly you feel this intense, overwhelming wave of defensiveness.
Your heart rate spikes, your face flushes.
Yeah, your brain isn't reacting to a spreadsheet. Your DMN has calculated that this critique threatens your competence, which threatens your employment, which threatens your survival. Or maybe it just touches on a deep wound of feeling inherently unworthy.
So a minor correction feels like an existential threat.
Exactly. It feels like life or death.
And because that internal wound is just too painful to examine, the ego projects it outward. It places the unexamined shame onto the coworker, deciding that they are malicious or incompetent.
And we usually call that being perceptive.
Right, the ego labels this projection as discernment. But true discernment is evaluating the external reality of the spreadsheet. Egoic projection is evaluating the external world based entirely on the need to protect a hidden internal wound.
So we have this hardened scar tissue, this wounded guardian. If we know we can't use a sledgehammer to break it down, how do we actually coax the nervous system into safely relaxing its grip?
How do we get it to let go?
Yeah, how do we introduce flexibility back into that architecture?
Well, Tanguy explores the mechanics of what he calls ego dissolution, which is the temporary softening of those rigid identity boundaries.
Temporary being the key word there.
Yes, this is the moment the inner narrator goes quiet. The mind stops constantly referencing every single incoming piece of data back to the I.
The source material dives into multiple mechanisms for this, right? It can happen spontaneously through profound awe, like standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon.
Or through deep grief, intense breathwork, deep meditative states.
But Tanguy also dedicates a significant amount of time to the pharmacology of psychedelics, specifically how compounds like psilocybin act on the hardware we were just talking about.
The DMN. The mechanism there is genuinely fascinating. Neuroimaging shows that classical psychedelics significantly decrease blood flow and metabolic activity in the hub centers of the default mode network.
So it literally turns the volume down on the narrator.
It does. And as the DMN quiets down, other regions of the brain that normally never communicate with each other begin to crosstalk. The rigid routing of the operating system is temporarily bypassed.
But the text is extremely rigid in its cautions here. We have to be clear on this. Tanguy makes it very, very clear that bypassing the OS is not a magic pill.
No, it's not a shortcut.
If a person has massive amounts of unresolved, trauma-thick psychological scar tissue, and they rapidly dissolve those boundaries without a supportive setting, the brain doesn't interpret that as mystical unity.
No, it interprets it as sheer terror.
It feels like fragmentation. It feels like you're losing your mind.
That is exactly why the phrase ego death is fundamentally misleading and, honestly, potentially dangerous. The organism does not want to die. When forced, the ego will fight back with massive panic.
Which makes sense. It's trying to protect you.
Right. But in a safe, integrated environment, whether that's achieved through decades of meditation or a legally sanctioned, clinically guided psychedelic session, what softens is simply the rigid identification with the narrative.
The story view becomes porous.
Exactly.
I visualize it a lot like a house. Ego dissolution isn't about burning down the house you live in.
No, that will leave you homeless.
Right. It's more like finally unlocking the front door, stepping out onto the porch, and realizing there is an entire breathing universe outside your living room.
That's a beautiful analogy.
You still have the house to sleep in, but you aren't a prisoner to its walls anymore. You can go outside.
And this reveals a vital truth about the architecture of awareness. The structure only loosens when it perceives safety.
Safety is the prerequisite.
Absolutely. You can create those conditions through somatic therapy, nervous system regulation, or meditative practices.
Yeah.
But you cannot bully the self into awakening.
Force just creates more resistance.
Always. Furthermore, the validity of that porch stepping experience isn't proven by how intense or mystical the peak moment felt. It is proven by integration.
Meaning, what happens after?
Exactly. How do you behave when you walk back inside the house?
That transition from the internal house to the external world is where Tanguy pulls all of this together into a much larger narrative.
He zooms way out.
He scales the concept of boundaries all the way up from the individual skull to the planetary level.
This is where the text gets incredibly visionary.
Yeah. The argument is that an individual ego that perceives itself as entirely separate from its environment inevitably scales into a civilization that views humanity as separate from nature.
It is the macro-ecological consequence of a hardened internal boundary.
As within, so without.
Precisely. When a culture operates collectively from a state of defended, isolated ego, the living world is instantly reduced to an object.
It just becomes resources.
Forests cease to be complex, communicating networks, and just become board feet of inventory. Rivers become mere infrastructure for waste. The Earth is no longer a territory we belong to, it's just a map we exploit.
To counter this, he introduces the Gaia hypothesis, which was originally developed by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis.
Such an important framework.
And it isn't a mystical concept, it's a systems-based biological framework. Margulis's work on symbiosis basically proved that the Earth functions as a self-regulating, interdependent web of feedback loops.
The atmosphere, the oceans, and biological life continuously interact to maintain planetary homeostasis.
We are literally a localized node of processing power within a planetary-scale operating system.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains why awakening, in Tanguay's framework, is not a retreat into the self. It's a conscious participation in what he calls the pattern.
The pattern.
Moving from a defended ego to a responsive identity means recognizing those feedback loops. Your personal boundaries soften just enough to allow the intelligence of the larger system to inform your actions.
The ego transforms from a defensive wall into a permeable doorway.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I have to play devil's advocate for a moment.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I dissolve my boundaries and realize I am just a localized node in this massive Gaian feedback loop, does that risk erasing my individual agency?
That's a very common concern.
Because we see this sometimes in spiritual communities. People become so one with the universe that they lose their personal drive. Or they use cosmic interconnectedness as an excuse to ignore mundane personal responsibilities.
Oh, the classic spiritual bypass.
Exactly. I don't need to pay my taxes. I am the universe.
Well, Tanguay anticipates that exact bypass. Dissolving boundaries permanently would mean returning to chaos. You'd lose the ability to feed yourself or care for your children.
Right. You still need the OS to run the daily apps.
Yes. True awakening is the maturation of identity, not the destruction of it. You keep your name, you maintain your history, you pay your electric bill.
You still do the laundry?
You still do the laundry. But because the DMN is no longer hijacking every moment to simulate threats against your ego, you become incredibly spacious.
You're not operating out of fear anymore.
Right. You fulfill your individual responsibilities, but your motivations are aligned with the health of the larger pattern rather than just hoarding resources for your own defense.
So we set out today to find the you that wants to awaken. And what we found in the architecture of self is that the ego isn't a parasite.
Not at all.
It is a brilliant, necessary inner architect that builds the boundaries you need to survive. It is a wounded guardian that wrapped you in scar tissue when the world was objectively unsafe.
It did its job.
It did. And by recognizing the predictive loops of your default mode network and by offering that guardian safety instead of violence, you allow those rigid boundaries to soften.
You step onto the porch. You witness the territory without confusing it for the map.
And for you, listening to this, the ultimate utility of absorbing all this information isn't to stack up more facts so you can build a taller, more intellectually defended fortress.
That would entirely miss the point.
Exactly. The goal is to understand the mechanics of your own mind so you can become more transparent, so you can consciously participate in the larger ecosystem you are already a part of.
Knowing that your current identity is an architecture built almost entirely from past survival strategies, the most vital question you can ask yourself today is this. Now that you realize you are the awareness observing the house, rather than just the walls themselves, what kind of new windows and doors will you consciously choose to build tomorrow?